In part 2, we'll take a look at specific MI techniques that are used to help have conversations about change with clients. These techniques, open-ended questions, affirmations, reflections of content, feeling, and meaning, summarizing, and providing information and feedback after receiving permission from the client, are used in a way that is strategic and thoughtful, such that we have the client always talking about reasons for change rather than reasons against it. Open-ended questions are questions that start with who, what, where, when, why, and how, and also the phrase, "tell me more about." Open-ended questions must be answered with more than yes or no, and they encourage the exploration of thoughts, feelings, actions, and beliefs. One caution regarding open-ended questions is to use the question why cautiously. Oftentimes clients, particularly children and teens, don't know why they do things. So considering the way you might rephrase a why question into a what or a how question can be useful, particularly when working with younger clients. Affirmations are used to affirm a specific thought, belief, or action. They are specific and strengths-based. They're focused on the client, not based on your opinions or values. This can sometimes be difficult because we as counselors want to say things like, "good job," or "I really liked how you said that." But that implies that our value of the client is part of the process. Instead, an example of an affirmation that would be congruent with MI is something like, "you're really committed to things you believe in." Affirmations are best when you're noticing and acknowledging a client's strength or value, or something that he or she is doing that it was challenging and that the client was successful in accomplishing. Reflections of content, feeling, and meaning are statements that repeat back to the client what you heard the client say, the feeling underneath what they said, and the meaning underlying what it is that you heard the client say. These are basic counseling techniques. However, when we're using reflections in terms of motivational interviewing, we're always focusing on how our reflections can keep the client talking about change. It's important to keep in mind that your reflections should be based on what the other person is saying without your judgments or interpretations. Particularly when reflecting meaning, it can get challenging to make sure that we're staying true to the client's intentions and not interpreting or adding our own input on what the client said. Be prepared when you use a reflection for the client to correct you. And if the client corrects you, it's important to take what the client's saying and proceed with that. For example, if I reflect to a client, it sounds like you were enraged. And the client comes back and says, "no, I wasn't really enraged. I was just kind of annoyed." It's important to go with what the client said. So you were annoyed, not really incredibly angry, and to proceed from there. You may choose to amplify your reflections in order to get the client to state more clearly what he or she means. Summarizing is the next MI technique. Summarizing is, again, a basic counseling skill that connects ideas or themes heard during the discussion and shows that you've heard what the client's saying. Summarizing in motivational interviewing is a little bit different, however, in that you'll strategically consider what to include in the summary so that when you end your summary, the conversation is focused on change. Summaries can be helpful for transitioning a conversation that's been focused on reasons not to change, to highlight themes strategically to show client strengths, client motivations, or client goals, and also to position the conversation in such a way that the next statement the client makes is an argument for change. One example of a summary that does this might be something like, "So I've heard you say you're frustrated that you got caught. You feel angry and powerless when you don't feel like you have choices. You're really committed to things that are important to you, and you work hard to succeed at your goals." This summary highlights some of the frustrations the client stated while also ending on an affirmation that will then allow the client to talk about how he or she succeeds and works hard to meet goals, and then transitions into what goals the client would like to have related to change and or his or her reasons for coming to counseling. There are additional techniques that can be used within the scope of MI, and several of them will be presented here. In addition, I highly recommend the viewers of this module take a look at Miller and Rolnick's Motivational Interviewing 3rd edition book, where a lot more information on all of the topics discussed here and more information on additional techniques can be studied. One of the techniques that makes motivational interviewing a little bit different than some other forms of counseling is the way that providing feedback is viewed. Because the client is viewed as the expert in the counseling setting, your observations as a counselor should only be provided after asking for permission and being granted permission from the client to share them. It's important that you use feedback judiciously. And when you ask for permission, there are a couple of different ways to do it. One is to just ask for permission. This might sound something like, "I've noticed something I'd like to get your thoughts on. Would it be all right if I share what I'm thinking with you?" Another way to ask for permission when asking would not really fit well into the conversation would be to say something like, "I don't know if this is a good fit for you at all, but I'm thinking," and then go ahead with your feedback. It allows the client an opportunity to reject whatever feedback you have if it isn't a good fit, while also not breaking up the conversation by posing a question. In addition to these two ways of asking for permission, if the client gives you permission by asking you specifically, "What would you do in this situation?" or "What do you think?" it is considered to have permission from the client if they're asking you for feedback. Be prepared for the possibility that your feedback may increase resistance, especially if you provide feedback through an expert stance. One way to do this might be to offer a menu of options. Something like, "I've worked with other clients who have found a couple of things helpful. Would it be all right if I share them with you?" One of the things clients have found helpful is making a list of their triggers. Another client found it helpful to have a text friend that he or she could text. A third client said that when they found themselves having a hard time, that they would take a bathroom break and do some meditation. I wonder if any of these sound like they'd be a good fit for you. This allows you to avoid the expert stance while also offering clients options that he or she can provide you with feedback on, including some ideas that might not have occurred to you otherwise. Similar to providing feedback, offering advice requires that the client is an active partner in the process. Because advice is just a type of information, it's important that you ask permission from the client or obtain permission prior to giving advice. Again, avoiding falling into the expert trap is really important, particularly when you're providing suggestions. It's important that you offer advice sparingly, and ideally, the client will be asking you for advice and you'll be providing it based on his or her questions. Again, offering a menu of choices and emphasizing that the client is ultimately the deciding factor in whether the advice is useful or not is important. Again, like with the providing feedback example, couching your observations or your suggestions through the lens of some clients have found it helpful, and then providing several different options and asking the client whether or not any of these might fit for him or her can be one way to help support the client in receiving advice and feedback without causing him or her to feel like you're falling into the expert stance. The next two techniques are similar in terms of the way that they're executed. They're the importance and confidence rulers, and they focus on assessing or scaling the client's perceived level of importance in making changes and his or her confidence that they're capable of making the changes. You'll start with the phrase on a scale from 1 to 10, with 1 being not at all important and 10 being completely important. Again, if you're using confidence, it would be not at all confident and completely confident. And then after the client provides a number on the scale, you ask why not one number lower. It's important to only go one number lower because you can learn more about where the ambivalence is coming from. And then you ask the client what would need to happen to move from the number they selected to one number greater. And the reason that you want to go one number greater is because the client can articulate very clearly what he or she would have to do differently, or what circumstances would need to be different in order for the client to be able to follow through on the change or to value it. So here's an example of how the importance ruler might begin to play out. On a scale of 1 to 10, how important is it to you to make the change you identified related to your alcohol use? Client would say a 2. It doesn't really matter to me, but I don't want to get in trouble anymore. So the counselor would say, what made you choose a 2 and not a 1? From here, the client would talk about why it's at a 2 and not a 1, which might be reasons like, my family's worried, I don't want to get in trouble, and that is important. And from there, the client would go into what would need to happen to move from a 2 to a 3 in terms of importance. Confidence ruler works the exact same way. Here's an example. The counselor would start by saying, on the same scale of 1 to 10, how confident are you that if you decided to make a change, you would be successful? Typically, this is posed after the client has articulated a specific change he or she would like to make. And the client might reply back something like, I don't think I need to make a change, but when I put my mind to something, I make things happen. I'm probably at a 7. After going through the conversation, why a 7 not a 6, the counselor would pose the question, what would need to happen for you to move from a 7 to an 8? And in this part of the conversation, the client would probably say things like, well, I would need to tell people about the change I want to make so I can have some accountability. Or I need to make a list of the people who can support me and make sure that I follow through when I'm struggling. By moving up just 1, the client will get more specific about what would need to happen in order for their plan to be successful. The rulers are really helpful in assessing client motivation to change and also to help them clarify specific reasons for making the change in terms of importance, how successful they could be, and why in terms of confidence. This module was presented for the Impacts Project at Youngstown State University. This project is supported by the Health and Resources and Services Administration of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. For more information about the contents of this PowerPoint, it's important to consider the resource Miller and Rolnick, Motivational Interviewing, 3rd edition, which was published in 2013. If you have any questions for the person who created this module, you can contact me at aewilliams02@ysu.edu.